Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's virtual office hour. My name is Cassandra McGee, and I'm a Senior Program Manager with JFF, and we are happy that you took time out of your schedule to join the conversation today. As a reminder, this session will be recorded, so please ensure your phone is muted if you are not the primary speaker. However, we really want this to be a conversation, so feel free to answer any questions or pose comments based upon today's topic. You can do that via the chat function, or there will be time for question and answer that you can do live. Our topic today is competency-based programs, and the discussion will be led by Jerry Ghazi with the Institute for American Apprenticeships. And with that, welcome again, and I'll turn it over to Andrea Messing-Mathy, a director with JFF. Andrea?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. As Cassandra mentioned, there's a half an hour, 2 times a month, opportunities for the field to connect either with you or with some subject matter expert that we have identified to help support certain topics. So as always, this is a pilot, and we are keen to hear more about different topics that you're interested to hear about and look forward to the conversation. So with that, I'll pass it on to Jerry.
Thank you, Andrea. Jerry Ghazi, everyone. Nice to meet you all, and thank you for spending the time with us in this half hour. So my goal is to really focus on youth apprenticeships in the competency-based model. And so one of the first things that comes to mind when dealing with competency-based models for youth apprenticeships is, what do you consider a youth apprenticeship? Right, there's a lot of talk about, well, a youth apprenticeship is an individual who's between the ages of 16 and 21, or maybe 16 and 24. And that could be true in terms of grants that you may have received and what you actually have submitted to a grantee for who you would be serving. But the technical definition of a youth apprenticeship or a youth apprentice is an individual, high school student, in school or out of school, that actually is the age of 16 and 17, right? Once they reach the age of 18, they are actually considered an adult apprentice, right? So what this kind of talk will be about today is focusing on youth apprenticeships, and really those that are focused on the ages of 16 and 17 years of age. Now, that's a generic technical definition of a youth apprenticeship, right? So, and within the USDOL and the National Apprenticeship Act, when you're dealing with a youth apprentice, one of the key aspects is that you must get the parents' permission, right? So on the forms in which USDOL uses to register a youth apprentice, there is a signature line for the parent as well. Once the individual turns 18, they're no longer considered youth, and therefore they would actually be an adult apprentice. And that's the technical definition. Now, each state may actually have their own definitions for what they consider to be a youth apprentice, particularly those states which run under what we call this SAA, or the State Apprenticeship Agency, like Florida or Nevada. Their statutes define what an apprenticeship program is, and the regulations do, and they may have more detailed definitions on what they consider a youth apprentice to be. So what we're going to be talking about today, and the topic is going to be really focused on those that are 16 and 17 years of age, right? So normally those individuals are high school students, right? So the next question to ask oneself is, okay, if I'm looking at 16 and 17-year-olds, is a youth apprenticeship appropriate for those that are in school, out of school, or both? And the key is, the answer is both, right? Because as long as the individual is between the ages of 16 and 17, you could still register them as a youth apprentice, even though they're out of school. Now, many of your grants that you receive, the funding that you may receive to actually put on programs, whether it's state funding or federal funding, may direct you to focus on a particular population, like in-school youth or just on out-of-school youth. But technically, again, going back to the definition of a youth apprenticeship or a youth apprentice, it's any individual between the ages of 16 and 17, right? So, in fact, when you're thinking about developing youth apprenticeships for that population of 16 and 17-year-olds, you can consider those that are in school or those that are out of school. Again, looking to your funding source to define the subset of those two, which your funding source may be supporting. So, and again, I want to pause. Are there any questions on those first two that I just kind of went through? And Cassandra, if you don't mind, is there a chat on this? There is a chat, right?
Yes.
So,
No questions.
right. So if people want to throw anything in the chat, please do. So what we're going to focus now on is because of those two age groups. So what's the best way of approaching developing and identifying youth apprenticeships? So the next question I ask is, outside of apprenticeship, what traditional models exist that we can look to help us really define whether a youth apprenticeship opportunity is something that should be pursued? And the first thing that comes to my mind are the CTE centers, right? So in many high schools, and I in my own career have been through probably 4 different unregistered apprenticeship programs. And my very first one I participated in was in high school. I was a 16-year-old high school student, and I decided to do work study. And that work study basically allowed me release time during the day to go work at a chocolate factory. And basically it was a candy barn where they made homemade candies. And I actually had to learn how to make homemade candy. So for a period of a year, I was apprenticed under a master candy maker, right? And that was through my CTE program at my high school, right? So a lot of high schools, they basically emulate all the elements of a apprenticeship program, right? And there are 5 core elements really to any apprenticeship program. The first is employment. An individual apprentice must be employed, and they can be employed as a high school student as well as an adult. The second element is that there's some related instruction associated with the occupation that they're apprenticing in, right? And so for my occupation, right, a chocolate maker, I basically was sent off to classes to learn about the different consistencies of chocolate and how to make various candies. So it wasn't 144 hours strict in-class education. Much of it happened as direct instruction from the master chocolatier who was instructing me on that, right? The second element, that being the related instruction. The third element that's really important that most CTE programs have, right, is the on-the-job learning. And so many CTE programs that I know of, like in the automotive area or in the culinary area, they emulate an apprenticeship because they have the students actually working, maybe in a school store, maybe in a school dining room, and actually apprenticing, or actually working, I should say, not apprenticing because they're not registered. They're working side by side with their instructor on preparing food, maybe in a culinary institute. In the automotive shops, they're actually working on real cars. And at my high school, this is way back in 77, right? We had actually, you can take your car, pay a fee, and have the kids in the automotive section work on your car. They were doing real work, right? Again, CTEs have inherently in them a model for so forth 3 of them. If the student can be paid, right? If the student has getting instruction, if the student has on-the-job learning experiences, and then the third or the fourth and fifth one is where you help individual CTE programs look at, we look at those to say, can you actually increase the wages of that individual? If a person participated in a CTE program over a period of maybe more than 1 year, and they were actually working maybe in a culinary shop or a culinary environment or in an automotive shop, are they being paid? And if so, are there any increases in that? So I look to CTE programs to think about a model in which the elements, and the last element, I apologize, there's 5 elements, is basically a completion of it. So you're taking an individual through to become fully competent in the occupation, and that's the national credential they receive under apprenticeship. So those 5 elements, when I look at, where am I going to start with in developing a youth apprenticeship program, I look at the CTE programs. And the reason, more importantly, I look at the CTE programs is because many times those CTE programs in high schools are already tied to employers. And they would have employer advisory committees, right? And so we look at CTE programs with employer advisory committees, and I've done inquiries with those advisory committees on seeing how many of those folks from the CTE program that they're advising on actually do they hire after high school. And those that have a substantial percentage of hires, we actually say that's the perfect kind of wrapper, right? An individual employer who's advising within a CTE program that hires its graduates. It's the perfect opportunity to put a wrapper around that traditional model of CTE and put a wrapper of apprenticeship around it. Let me pause for a second, see if there's any questions around that traditional model. With this, okay, so let's move on to now, why do competency-based apprenticeships work best for you, right? So there are 3 types of apprenticeships that you can develop. The first one is a competency-based one. Second one is a time-based, and the third one is hybrid, right? And in the time-based one, it's basically you're counting hours, right? And many times time-based ones are used in the trades, and an individual themselves are going to go through a elongated process. Maybe it's a 3-year apprenticeship or a 4-year apprenticeship. And in the trades, there's a seniority level that happens, and an individual will wind up getting a license to be able to work as a master electrician, a master plumber in that given occupation or discipline. When you're dealing with youth apprenticeships, right? The other one again is competency-based, and a hybrid is a combination of the two where you have a minimum number of hours and then you have a maximum number of hours. And once you reach the minimum, it turns into a competency-based. The reason that I have found in youth apprenticeships that competency-based apprenticeships are the ones that employers want is because they want to see that individual get to full competency as quickly as possible. And many times the transition from high school, the youth, the 16 and 17-year-old, into that work environment, being 18, graduating high school, and then becoming a full-time employee of that, is a natural progression for a competency-based because the hours during their school time, if they're an in-school youth, working as part of their summer, right? They start at 16, they work the summer full-time for the employer as an apprentice. They go back to finish their senior year at high school, and they work part-time for the employer, right? And the employer's gauging them on their ability to master those competencies, right? They're not just counting the hours. They want to see if this individual can reach that full competency. So we have designed programs based on a competency-based system for the individual to start during the summers full-time, go part-time during their senior year, and then return full-time to complete their apprenticeship as a full-time employee of that organization. Because the goal of these youth apprenticeships are to turn the individual from a youth apprentice to either an adult apprentice, right, which is simply reaching the age of 18, and continuing on with that employer that's sponsoring them as a youth apprentice, right? Employers are really interested in ensuring that the individual is competent. They don't want to just count time for that individual. So the important thing about a competency-based program is that when you set one up, you have the work processes just like you have with a time-based system, but you also have metrics in which are going to be evaluated, right? There'll be a set of metrics in which each apprentice is evaluated against to determine whether they're reaching full competency. And it creates a feedback loop during that competency-based program to ensure that the individual is progressing on the right pathway to full competency. Where many times in a time-based system or a hybrid, you're only counting hours up front, right? And you may not have those cycles of evaluation that the employer wants to see as part of their apprenticeship program, so that they can ensure that if the person isn't on track for completing and reaching full competency, they can make the necessary adjustments in a more fine-tuned way by having more of those review processes based on the competencies and achieving those competencies. So in my experience, the competency-based programs give the employer kind of the knowledge and the confidence that as an individual youth goes through it, that there will be these review cycles happening more frequently to ensure that they can provide the necessary guidance and mentoring, and that there could be more interventions occurring throughout their apprenticeship so that the person can reach full competency over the duration of it, right? And that's really one of the key aspects on where we have found competency-based systems. Many times too, competency-based systems, right, accelerate the completion of the program based on the individual themselves. So some individuals will take longer than others to complete the program. And when you're dealing with youth, that range of completion is a lot broader. It's a lot wider because you're dealing with individuals 16 to 17 years old, right? They may have a lot of other things happening in their life at that moment in time they're participating in it, right? So the competency-based is a progression that really takes into consideration the individual apprentice as they go through the program itself. And so that's really one of the key reasons why to use competency-based apprenticeships and why they work best in a youth environment. Again, defining youth as those individuals who are 16 or 17 years of age. Now, again, many of your grants will talk about a youth apprenticeship being between the ages of 16 and 21, the participants, right? But once they reach the age of 18, it's considered an adult apprenticeship, right? That person is considered like any other apprentice. Then we move on to the next thing is, what are some of the extra factors to consider as part of creating a competency-based youth apprenticeship program? And one of the biggest ones that I've heard from employers is around OSHA, right? We have set up many different programs in the advanced manufacturing arena for 16 and 17-year-olds. And the first thing that when you approach an employer that they say is, well, we can't have them working on equipment at the age of 16 and 17. And I had a recent conversation with one of the state's directors about apprenticeship. And they were saying, you know, we really haven't focused on youth because of the OSHA regulations in our state, as well as the federal OSHA regulations. And then I pointed them to the fact that there is an exception to the federal OSHA regulations, and we also found the same exception to their state regulations. So one thing that a registered apprenticeship allows an organization to do is to bring on apprentices at the ages of 16 and 17 and have them work on equipment that otherwise would be prohibited under OSHA law, because they are part of a registered apprenticeship system. They are part of a registered apprenticeship program. And when I have pointed those statutes and regulations out to employers, they have a sigh of relief, because then all of a sudden they open up and say, so it is possible, right? The next question they said, what happens if someone gets injured, right? These are youth, will my insurance cover it? And that's when we start having conversations, depending on whether the person is an in-school or out-of-school youth apprentice. If they're an in-school youth apprentice, many times, just like the CTE programs, the insurance of the school covers a student when working at an employer. So if it's part of a sanctioned program of academic delivery, right? And many times a youth apprenticeship program, the related instruction, individuals will be able to get not dual enrollment, but will be able to get credit for high school by taking those related instruction classes, right? So it becomes part of their academic record at the high school level. And that has also, and that insurance that follows that student, as long as they're participating in this, and you're considering this youth apprenticeship program married to the school itself. When I say married, it doesn't mean the school has to be the sponsor, but there's a direct correlation between the schools, maybe the CTE, et cetera, that you're able to overcome some of the insurance concerns that employers have, right? And that happens in healthcare. It also happens in advanced manufacturing and also in the trades, right? So there are the things that you want to look to, is the regulations and statutes would give exceptions to the fact that many people will just discount and say, well, I don't want to consider youth because youth, first of all, they can't work in the environment that we have. We would never put someone on the floor um, working these machines unless they were 18 or old. And the question becomes, well, why? If it's sanctioned and you actually have the ability and you actually do want to develop these individuals, the law permits it. So would you consider it? And we've had youth apprentices, 16 and 17 years, working on massive CNC machines. One of the companies in Vermont is called Husky Injection Molding, and they make the injection molds for companies around the world. And those molds, they start out with a block of metal that must be 4 feet high by 4 by 6 feet and about 3 feet thick that they are machining. And these pieces of metal are all moved by cranes from station to station. And we have youth apprentices on the floor working those machines. You can actually walk inside some of the CNC machines, but they're always with, again, their mentor, right? So the mentor is there and they're working side by side running these machines and they're in line of sight. So there is the opportunities to create these programs where otherwise employers may say, well, I'm not interested because of this or that. So that's a key factor to consider, right? These, yes.
There's a couple questions. One I sent you directly that came in. The first one is, are there certain industries that you found to be more open to utilizing competency-based programs for youth? And then if you look in chat, Ryan Gensler also posed a question.
Okay, so let me answer that one first. The industries that I find is IT, right? The software industry, right? Because these individuals in the high school level are coming equipped with knowledge of software development, programming, et cetera, that sometimes surpasses those in a college level. And over the course of 20 years of running these types of programs, we have actually had success in the IT field because it basically, that technological knowledge possessed by a high school student sometimes equates to that possessed by a college student. So they're open to that. The more difficult ones that we had are in the healthcare. And because the insurance involved and the requirements within a healthcare. However, we have been successful at breaking some of those barriers down. At Dartmouth Hitchcock, I believe we had 1 or 2 youth apprentices. They wanted to try it out in a clinical area where there was patient access, but it wasn't like, I can't remember actually the program. It might have been an LNA program that we did that was successful for these, bringing them on into high school and then converting them immediately upon graduation to full-time employees, right, in college. So healthcare is a difficult one. IT is an easy one. Advanced manufacturing is an easy one, right? A lot of people say, well, that must be a difficult one. But no, in fact, advanced manufacturers, because they're so desperate for the talent, are starting to dive into the high schools and basically present to the high schools, and for those seniors and for the juniors, rising seniors, which they're juniors, going off this summer and will coming back as seniors. Those have been critical success points for gathering both parent support as well as employer support because they are so much in need of that. Let me take a look at the chat. So there's another question. You said, Ryan, let's see, do you have any insights on how employers access the mastery of competencies, particularly for less technical occupations than in manufacturing, like HR? So when you say that, how do they actually, I'm assuming you have insights on how employers assess, right? So the mastery of those skill sets. So you found the rubric, right? Ryan, you're absolutely right. People use rubrics. And so when we lay out an appendix, let's say for a given occupation, we lay out the work processes. And then in a separate document, we actually lay out for each work processes 5 or 6 metrics that we're going to measure against that work process, right? And that works for HR, it works for marketing, banking, because everyone's performance plan, when you think about an occupation, all occupations, right? You're bringing a person to fulfill responsibilities, but those responsibilities have to be measurable and determine whether they fulfill them or not. So what we do is we do a deeper dive with employers to say, for your instance of, let's say, an HR specialist. For you as an employer, these are the work processes that we have outlined as part of the apprenticeship. But on the separate document, how are you going to evaluate that? So let's come up with 3 or 4 what we call metrics, right? And the values for those metrics, it may be number of claims processed, or number of resumes reviewed, or time to fill an open rec for an HR person, right? We actually create the metrics, right, the variables, and then we actually set what is the value they should hit upon full competency. And in our programs at the Institute for American Apprenticeship, we actually meet with the students, meet with the apprentices on a monthly basis and review the metrics as a scorecard to see where they're on. And we make adjustments to their performance, their adjustments to either their mentoring or their education plan or their work processes to ensure that they're hitting those metrics. And if they're hitting or exceeding them in a competency-based one, we'll accelerate their apprenticeship to full competency. I hope that answered your that assessment. And I'm just want to read on. It says, we found the rubric, for example, tasks by competency to be helpful, but it's still an assessment, which is very subjective. And yet all assessments, right, can be objective, but you can also put objective metrics in there, right? So for instance, when we did something at dealer.com here in Vermont, it's a software development company. It was competency-based, and it was for account managers, and they were to support technical issues at a customer. And we had time to completion of a technical issue, or they were doing upselling as well. So number of upsells. And I want to answer that last question now. Any advice for employers who have policies stating they cannot hire individuals under the age of 18, except as, well, this is kind of scary. So if there is an employer who actually says they can't hire individuals under the age of 18, except as a 1099, that makes me nervous, because a 1099 employee means they're fully competent. So if you look at what the definition of a 1099 employee is, it specifically means that person can work independently of, without direct supervision or direction from the employer, right? So I would think that they may be under misimpression, so what that individual, Cecilia, I would encourage you to Google 1099 employee, and what factors does one consider? And then when you see those, and it's federal law, what a 1099 employee is, when you look at it and you see the factors in some of the articles, I think you'll determine that, wow, I can't see a 16 or 17-year-old reaching that full competency in the position they want to bring them on. Now you say, is there something to registration that can help make a case for a W-2, right? And the key about the W-2 employee is as a registered apprenticeship, they need to be W-2s, right? So if you want to get the benefits of being 16 and 17-year-olds in an apprenticeship, which will forego the OSHA, right? It doesn't relieve you of being a safe environment, but it allows those individuals to work in it. You must be in an apprenticeship, right? And therefore, to be an apprenticeship, you must be a W-2 employee. And that's how I would sell it to that employer.
So Jerry, we have 2 questions that are coming in. I know we're about to run short on time, so we do welcome you to continue the conversation with us over in our community of practice. And so there should have been a link in the invitation that you received for today's session. So one was about in New York that they're having difficulty selling competency-based programs because they require third-party certification and they can't come from the employer. So they're doing a lot of time-based. So some thoughts about that. Then also about how to propose full-time summer and part-time school programs for employers that don't want to initially consider part-time positions or part-time hires.
So the first one, it's a tough one with New York, right? Because New York is what we call a SAA state, a state apprenticeship agency, which means New York has its own statutes that are supposed to be in conformance with the federal statutes and regulations. and they have their own regulations. So the first thing I would do is I would look closely at those regulations and statutes in New York and find the language that says that they have to be certified by a third party. Many times people will tell you something about the certification of a competency-based when there's nowhere found in statute or nowhere found in regulation. And if you can't find it in the statute or the regulation, then someone is basically doing it subjectively, right? So I always go back to the SAA, the ATR in the state and say, can you please point to me the specific statute or regulation that says third-party validation must occur, right? And if it is that way, that's a very difficult thing to get around. And the second question that you asked, Cassandra, could you just repeat it again, please?
It's about how to work with employers that really want the youth apprentices to be full-time instead of what you mentioned was a full-time summer employee and then a part-time employee working hours during the school year.
Right. So my suggestion there would be to focus the recruitment with that employer that says, I want someone to come on 40 hours a week, regardless, right? And I don't want to change that. Then I would go after out-of-school youth. My focus would be on 16 and 17-year-olds that are out of school and say that's the population that I will bring to that employer, right? Most employers, right, you would then, and I would also start inquiring, well, do you have any interns? You know, do you have summer interns? Do you let them go at the end of the year? And the reason is, why do you want them to be full-time? And many times it's because they're afraid that when they go back to school, they'll lose that investment they made during the summer, right? That they'll go back to school and won't continue the relationship, and that person will then go on to do something else. And therefore, having them full-time all the time will ensure that connection. I would actually question in that area as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jerry and IAA, for leading today's discussion. As a reminder, please feel free to join us, and we welcome you to join us over in the Community of Practice for continued conversation and resources about registered youth apprenticeship. And I'll turn it over to Andrea to close us out today. Okay. So thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to you joining us for upcoming sessions. Again, if you want additional resources, join our Community of Practice, and always feel free to visit our website, jff.org. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.